Thank you. I often speak at these about Gardner's biography and Gardner's bibliography and things like that. Today I'm going to be a little bit more off topic in that sense. I'm going to concentrate on one of his skills, Martin Gardner as an annotator. Just so that everybody's on the same page, we can easily talk about all of the books he had written before the Annotated Alice. All right, he had some magic pamphlets, The Name of the Science, which was later Fads and Fallacies, Magic, Mathematics, Magic, and Mystery, Logic, Machines, and Diagrams, which came out of a Scientific American article that he wrote. He had lightly annotated The Wizard of Oz in a volume, Wizard of Oz and Who He Was. He had edited a bunch of essays on science, and of course his first mathematical games column had already come out. So this is where he was in his career when this came up, the Annotated Alice. Now, the Annotated Alice is something I would hope everybody in this room has read. I don't know if that's a safe assumption, but I will operate under that assumption. We all have read it. Now, I've recently spoken to the Lewis Carroll Society of North America, and those people have not only read it, but it is burnt into their retinas. Okay? It was an important watershed moment in that sort of scholarship. And we'll see later why it's been a watershed moment indirectly for lots of other similar literary scholarships. These are possible editions that you may have wanted to pick up. The originals, different publishers, same content. Eventually the content changed with more Annotated Alice. That changed, had completely new notes because he had a box full of notes from people that had sent things to him, and he was having arguments with the publisher of the previous edition. These were combined into something called the Complete Annotated Alice, which many of you don't have, but it came on floppy disk. So you could get all of these things combined on floppy disk so that they were machine searchable and some HTML aspects. But the definitive Alice came out later where he combined everything again and added more notes. It was very successful and led many years later to the 150th anniversary, about which Mark Burstein talked about at the last G4G. Now, of course, in addition to those, you could get paperback editions, or you could get British editions. There was a separate edition of a chapter called The Wasp and the Wig, which had several different covers. You could buy foreign translations, all right, Italian, Spanish, Chinese, Hebrew, etc. But more importantly to us is that it was a start of a career in annotation. After he had annotated this, 2 years later, he issued the Annotated Snark with a different publisher. The Annotated Snark was something that could have gone with the Annotated Alice because they share not only the same author, but they share a certain number of vocabulary, and you could reference between the two. But it was decided to issue it separately. Then there's the Annotated Ancient Mariner. By the way, I picked one up in Decatur yesterday. Anybody who wants it can buy it off me. All right. Annotated Ancient Mariner. Then he had the Annotated Thursday. The Man Who Was Thursday was perhaps his favorite novel of all, and so he annotated that for Ignatius Press. He loved G.K. Chesterton, so he also annotated Father Brown. The two I skipped, Casey at the Bat on the Night Before Christmas, represents a separate interest of his. He had a lifelong interest in what he called one-poem poets, poets that had incredible success with one poem and showed no talent after that. And so he annotated those as well. And there's another lightly annotated book by Lewis Carroll there. Okay. Now his taste in fiction, in case you're curious, ran to fantasy. He was very much involved with various fantasy authors, and he loved fantasy. He had, but the reason I'm mentioning this at all is that his interest in Carroll did not come from mathematics per se. It came from the intersection of his interests in fantasy and mathematics. In a 1959 letter to Dennis Flanagan, who was his editor, of course, at Scientific American, And he said, I'd like to start a magazine about science and the humanities. And you can see the quote there. I still think it's a good idea because Dennis Flanagan turned him down. I can't think of any science magazine that publishes fiction and philosophical articles. This is something early on he wanted to start himself. Of course, he needed help to start a magazine. It didn't happen. But he also said, I have another idea from a much earlier time. So for years, he'd been thinking about having a magazine called Marginalia, in which he would take stories and then he would annotate them. Of course, the name Marginalia comes from Edgar Allan Poe's book. But the point of annotating articles with experts that you would sell in a magazine to the public was something that was very much in his mind since the 40s. So it's not surprising that general interest merged with his interest in Lewis Carroll. Now, it's well known that he approached Bertrand Russell indirectly. He didn't write a letter directly to Bertrand Russell that we can find. But he approached Bertrand Russell indirectly to do this because he wanted an expert in the field to do it. And did that go away for you too? Did it? Yes, no? Okay. Well, keep going. Basically, he approached this and never worked out. And so people came and said to him, you should write the book yourself. And of course, he wasn't an expert, but he was a freelance writer who recently was starting a family, and he needed the money. So it took on importance to him for that as a writing project, even though he preferred somebody else would have done it. And so he collected everything that he could find, and I'll say more about that later. This is the 1958 prospectus that he sent to Clarkson Potter. That he sent to Clarkson Potter describing the intent of this volume. So, of course, he needed backing. Clarkson Potter was very supportive, so supportive that he got his publisher to agree to it against their better judgment. And when he left the company, he bought the rights to the book so that he could publish it himself with his own company. A little bit more from that annotation, a couple of the points that he listed. Humpty Dumpty's speech on words is an early and profound discussion of semantics. And Cheshire's cat is based on Cheshire cheese, peculiar in Carroll's time in the shape of a cat's head. Stuff that he imagined people would find amusing. Not necessarily a scholar, but you would have found amusing. So I'm going to propose a thesis that Gardner was sort of the progenitor of all annotated volumes. And in anticipation of your arguing that, no, annotation's been around forever, let me make sure that we're all in agreement on what annotation is. All right. Now, the word annotation has sort of fallen out of favor. Now, the official term amongst scholars is textual scholarship. But that's a broad term, and it covers lots of things, which I list here, including, near the bottom of the list, higher criticism, which is sort of the quintessential textual scholarship where people in the 1800s analyzed the Bible for authorship and did other things that took this to a very deep level, at the same time, a very scholarly level, and did not interest the public one bit. So what is annotation? Well, the truth is, you can call yourself an annotator if you pick from this list. So I'm not going to tell you what annotation is. It's a broad umbrella. Now, annotation, if you go into old books, look at incunabula, you will find there's writing in the margins. Don't be fooled. A lot of that writing in the margins is, I sold something to somebody else today, okay, because paper was hard to find. But then they started writing stuff in the margins, which were commentaries on the books. And of course, since people who had the books were the clerics were making comments of a literary nature. But the important thing is that they weren't commentaries meant for the public. They were commentaries because the books were so rare, no one else could see the books except for the ones they handed them to. They were meant to be a commentary for the next scholar. And more often than not, they were opinionated and downright cruel. Like, this pig clearly is a symbol of the Pope, that kind of thing. All right? So the idea was that there weren't annotations the way we expect them. They were opinions. And eventually, of course, this tradition had to come to grips with printing presses, and how do they continue to do this? Of course, they continued to write in the margins, but then the idea that more and more people than a handful of people would be reading what you said led to writing commentaries meant for a larger group of people. So just examples. Some of these are from the Princeton collection of annotated volumes. So you see on the left normal handwritten annotation, and you can see how that's a precursor for the unbearably long footnotes that came after that. And there's true marginalia written in the margins. That's very, very common. They often would write between the lines as well. But that's where it all got started. And two quotes I thought were interesting. Henry VIII said, Scripture speaks for itself without any annotations to the margins, because they were becoming so common, especially in the Geneva Bible. And James I, when he put out the King James, said, I do not want any annotations in the margins. So he had to prohibit them. It wasn't something that they asked for. He had to prohibit them. And that's an indication of how widespread they were, and also people's opinions thereof. My thesis here is that Gardner wrote the first annotated volume. Now, I think I can certainly get everybody to agree he wrote the first popular volume, because things were around already, of course. There were lots of footnoted volumes out there. Mostly, if they were literature, would have been in these what are called critical editions, where they would have a copy of the story or novel with light footnoting, usually glossary terms, and then there would be a bunch of essays bound to the book. That's not what I'm talking about, all right? That's not what we're talking about. Those were still meant for other scholars, perhaps undergraduate scholars, but still. So let's get some numerical evidence that Gardner started all this. 1960, he came out with the Annotated Alice. I can find nothing before 1960. 0 books annotated, except for the critical editions I've just mentioned. They certainly existed before. 62, his Snark came out. 62, also his friend, William S. Baring Gould, put out the annotated Mother Goose. And Baring Gould also put out the annotated Sherlock Holmes in 67. Gardner put out the annotated Mariner in 65. And the Casey at the Bat, and then Walden, and then Lolita. So things were coming out with a little bit more increasing speed. Many of them were through Clarkson Potter, but other publishers were getting involved. Wizard of Oz with Michael Patrick Hearn, a friend of Gardner's. In fact, Gardner helped this book come to fruition. So forth. You can see the list here. It's growing, it's growing, it's growing, it's growing, it's growing, it's growing, it's growing. All right, so there's a lot of, did I bump this button again? Hopefully it'll reset itself. So there's obviously a lot of numerical evidence that Gardner was the root of this explosion of interest in these annotated volumes. And there's not much people can say, I guess, against the thesis. But the thing is not just numerically, but the inspiration of how they look, the look and feel of these books, all owe to Martin Gardner. The thing here is that he had a personal vision. The thing you all have to appreciate about this is that he did not pattern this book on anybody else's work. That's Gardner's true contribution here, okay? He did not pattern this on anybody else's work. It was his vision, his idea of what annotation should be that guided all of these other books. The idea that annotation was meant to entertain the public, not to be funny or whatever. They were still based on scholarly works, but he would go through all of these scholarly works and with a good eye and a good ear know what people wanted to hear. he did that with a skill that comes from his sort of polymath view of the world that he always had, one that informed his Scientific American column as well. So you can see the quote there saying that he did not want to do original research, okay? Now, just to set this record straight, I have to give credit where it's due. The marginal glosses, instead of having footnotes or endnotes, the marginal glosses were not his idea. They were the idea of the graphic artist working on the annotated Alice. They were stuck in traffic, as the story goes, and this guy pulled out a piece of paper and wrote on his knee how the pages should look. So there are two types of annotations that I have done my best to avoid, not because they are difficult or should not be done, but because they are so exceedingly easy that any clever reader could write them for themselves. I refer to allegorical and psychoanalytical exegesis. He had a very low opinion of this approach, which of course is a large part of the scholarly market that he would dismiss as not being important. How am I doing for time? 2 minutes. Too bad. All right. How did he do it? He did it with a lifetime habit of careful reading. This is something that some of us appreciate better than others. He read carefully. He would read a book, he would underline it, write a summary in the margin, and you pull any book off of his shelf, you would have seen this careful reading. He would put things on index cards and store them away. And when he was working on a project, he would go into a library, stay in the library. He did a lot of hard work. But the hard work came not in the library, it came from the years of reading and followed by years of correspondence with other people. He relied heavily on other people's input. I don't have time for this. So, should we annotate Gardner? I would, of course, argue no. We should not be in the business of annotating Gardner. And the thing that comes to mind, of course, are the Scientific American columns. But what I would like to propose to the person who might be willing to take this idea up, certainly not me, it would be nice if we had a place that we could add to the bibliographies. As the subject matter of each column ages, we would like to know what's been done. He, of course, did this himself in his lifetime with the various addenda. But this would be, I think, an acceptable way to annotate his work going forward. And finally, a previous talk I gave here now is a book, which I believe is for sale somewhere. And I encourage you to seek it out if you enjoyed that previous talk. Thank you.